What would you do if you had to get your kid across town and you couldn't afford a train ticket? If you said, mail the kid, even just as a joke, you might be surprised to learn that it's already been done. Today, we're going to take a look at how parents used to literally mail their babies because it was cheaper than public transit. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other strange, antiquated practices you would like to hear about. Okay, got some mail here for you. Let's see. Junk, 20% off Bed Bath & Beyond. That's a keeper. Junk. Oh, look, it's a boy. The honor of being the first baby to ever be delivered via the mail goes to one James Beagle. His parents, an Ohio couple named Jesse and Matilda Beagle, no relation to the Hound, mailed James just a few short weeks after the service began operation. His intended destination was his grandmother's home, just a few miles away in Batavia. As an 8-month-old who weighed just under 11 pounds, James was still technically under the weight limit that the Postal Service was imposing at the time. And amazingly, the child was mailed to his grandparents. Fortunately for the child, the journey wasn't arduous, and he slept peacefully most of the way. According to researchers at the Smithsonian, mailing young James Beagle cost a mere 15 cents in postage. However, while that sounds like a bargain, his parents also insured him for $50, which was no small charge back then. While it might be difficult for modern folks to wrap their head around how parents could treat their kids no differently than they'd treat any other parcel, it made sense to enough people at the time. James's journey not only created a sensation, it also established a child mailing trend that would, believe it or not, continue for several years. As little as a year later, newspapers reported the story of a woman named E.H. Stanley of Wellington, Kansas, who had received her 2-year-old nephew by parcel post from his grandmother in Stratford, Oklahoma. According to the article, the boy wore a tag around his neck showing it had cost 18 cents worth of postage to send him through the mail. He was transported 25 miles along rural routes before actually reaching the railroad, but once aboard, he is reported to have ridden with the mail clerks and even shared his lunch with them. At first, child mailing was mostly restricted to smaller, younger kids, but as postal weight restrictions shifted and relaxed, older children began to be mailed as well. In 1914, a 4-year-old named Charlotte May Pierstorff was mailed from her home in Grangeville, Idaho, and sent via train to her grandparents, who lived about 74 miles away. The little girl's journey was widely publicized, and surprisingly, it charmed the public, so much so that it inspired a now legendary children's book called Mailing May. According to the Smithsonian, little May wasn't unceremoniously shoved into a canvas sack along with the other packages. As it turns out, she was accompanied on her trip by her mother's cousin, who worked as a clerk for the railway mail service. It's likely that his influence and his willingness to chaperone his young cousin is what convinced local officials to send the little girl along with the mail. We would love to be able to tell you that children were the most bizarre packages being sent through the postal system back in the early days, but that is not even remotely close. According to the Washington Post, when the parcel service began, all kinds of cargo showed up in the mail stream, including coffins, eggs, and dogs. And that was just the beginning. There were also a host of other questionable items being dispatched through the mail. Taxidermied animals, deadly and inadequately contained medical specimens like the smallpox virus, dead fish, and even buildings themselves. Yeah, buildings were actually mailed to their destinations in crushingly dense blocks of bricks that would be assembled later. Getting back to the kids, the longest known child postal journey was undertaken by one Edna Neff of Pensacola, Florida. Edna was a 6-year-old who created a stir when she was mailed to her father in Christiansburg, Virginia, which was over 720 miles away. While mailing children wasn't unheard of, Neff's trip, primarily because of its exhausting distance, was met with criticism rather than whimsical amusement, and it ended up being a major factor in child mailing becoming illegal in 1915. It just takes one person to ruin a good time. While it is giggle-inducing to imagine children wrapped up like a Christmas gift in colorful paper and a bow, and then sent off in the mail, that wasn't how it worked. Instead, the kids were more like companions or well-swaddled bundles in the arms of their carriers. In fact, in some cases, depending on the distance in question, they merely trotted along with the postman as he went on his route and were delivered along with the rest of the mail. Which brings us to another important piece of context, namely, the people who mailed their children weren't just handing them over to some stranger. In most rural areas, people knew their mail carriers personally and often relied on them for more than just bringing the mail. So the child likely knew the mail carrier they traveled with, which is kind of comforting. By many conventional measures, the early and mid-1900s represented a simpler and safer time for American society. Creepy vans with free candy signs on the side didn't exist. For that reason, local postmen were often considered to be beloved figures who were widely trusted by the citizens they worked for. By one account, the mail carrier was considered a crucial part of communities, a touchstone with family and friends far away from each other, a bearer of important news and goods. In some ways, Americans trusted their postmen with their lives and with their babies. To the average American of the era, when it came to trustworthiness, the mailman was right up there with the stork. Both were counted on to deliver your kids. When it came to traveling, it was all well and good to be a rich kid who could afford to take a trip in a luxurious first-class train compartment. But if you were a working-class child, things weren't quite as easy or comfortable. That's why sending children by post was considered by some to be a sensible economic solution. In fact, in some cases, the deliveries even took place off the record. Many who knew and trusted their small-town postmen would simply ask them to escort their child from one place to another without all the legalities. If you think about it, it's not too different than giving a Lyft driver a few extra bucks to go the extra mile. Since the image of the male child was largely a charming and quaint one, the practice wasn't seen as cruel or unusual by most people. Most people were far more concerned about the fact that the paper mail never seemed to arrive at its destination on time. In contrast to pretty much every other kind of parcel, there are no records of any mailed children suffering any kind of damage in transit or not reaching their destinations as scheduled. In fact, by most accounts, the Postmaster General's decision to outlaw the practice really had more to do with possible legal ramifications down the line, rather than anything that had actually happened. Basically, he just wanted to stop pressing his luck before some child ended up in the dead letter office. Though the practice of mailing children was formally outlawed in 1915, those restrictions were rarely enforced, although it may have been a case of not being necessary anymore since so few people were in the habit of mailing their offspring. Nevertheless, there are always those who try and skirt the system. A handful of kids were mailed and delivered between 1914 and 1915, but by the time 1916 rolled around, the practice had ceased. The last child carried by mail appears to be 3-year-old Maud Smith, whose grandparents sent her 40 miles to see her sick mother in August of 1915. Superintendent John Clark of the Cincinnati Division of the Railway Mail Service conducted an investigation into why the child was transported even though it was against regulations. History doesn't record the outcome of that investigation, but historians assume someone probably got reprimanded. As late as 1920, the postmaster was still rejecting multiple applications to mail children, but Maud, as far as we know, was the last to actually be taken. Despite all that, the idea of naive parents mailing their children may be a little too entertaining to be true. According to the researchers at Snopes.com, the few documented examples of children being sent through the mail were nearly all publicity stunts. Snopes points out that all of the known cases of child mailing either involve people asking postal workers they personally knew to carry their babies along their routes to nearby relatives, or children who were technically listed as male so they could ride on a train without buying a ticket. There is no known instance of a parent simply dropping their child off at a post office with strangers for delivery to some far-off place. Moreover, the widely available photographs of mail carriers with children in their bags are simply staged shots that were taken to be humorous. But if you think the days of human parcels ended when the fad for mailing children petered out, guess again. As late as 1980, one William DeLucia caused a scandal when he packed himself in an airborne trunk along with food and an oxygen tank. As the U.S. Postal Museum explains it, upon arriving and landing at his intended post office, DeLucia climbed out, stole thousands of dollars worth of goods from the registered mail, and then sealed himself back up. While DeLucia wasn't the only one to attempt such a crime, those kinds of events ultimately went the way of the dodo, after the advent of scrupulous airport security and state-of-the-art package screening. As for DeLucia, his plan was foiled by way of a mishap. He was arrested at the Atlanta airport after his trunk popped open while it was being unloaded. So what do you think? Would you mail or FedEx your baby? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.